أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. I seek refuge in God from Satan, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. I bear witness that there is no God but God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the slave and messenger of God. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. First and foremost, thank you to Lamppost Productions and to Brother Khalil Mohsen for extending me an invitation to speak today. Thank you all for joining us. But of course, with a title this provocative, who can say no? I'm sorry that I'm going to be reading from my paper and not speaking with you directly, but inshallah, you will feel that I'm speaking directly to you, and I will feel that you're listening. The name of today's talk is Sex, Power, Politics, 21 Contentions. And the reason I'm here today on this Muslim educational platform, speaking on the connections between sex, power, and politics, is because it seems that in the last few years, several things have happened that, when taken together, form an arc. They form a trend. And what I'm finding is that increasing numbers of American Muslims are adopting a certain set of politics, especially pertaining to sexuality, female sexuality specifically, and homosexuality. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer politics. And I suggest that the adoption of these politics by many, many sisters and brothers signals that by espousing these ideas, the person is fulfilling a certain kind of role in our society, and a certain kind of role politically and economically, of being a certain political subject, of being a certain kind of Muslim subject. Some of the things that make me think I should reflect on sex and power and politics, and even share my reflections with other Muslims, are things like the recent article in the Muslimah Diaries, which you probably saw posted up on Lamppost, talking about the sexualization of Muslim women. My friends from college, sisters who I knew in the MSA, many of who today say that as a Muslim, if you don't support LGBTQ politics, you're homophobic. The Orlando nightclub shooting, and how it feels to see not only that there's been a massacre in your own country, but to find out that it's a Muslim brother who did it. Mona Haider's latest Dog Kalb, and the fact that it has actually been well received by so many people, and how sad that makes me. Sisters who contour their faces, you'll have to forgive me. Sisters who own more than a handful of makeup products, and how this sexualizes women. Sisters and brothers who take too many selfies, again, forgive me. And the way this relates to how we understand our own sexuality. A young journalist, Muhajjaba, who did an interview with Playboy magazine, and explained that it was authentic self-expression on her part, and how that's what made that okay. So these are some of the things that are making up an arc or a trend, and I want to speak about that trend, and I want to speak against it. In the United States, rights have become, in recent decades, the way that most people perform identity politics. And what I mean by that is that in recent decades, since the 1990s, since globalization began to set in, rights have become a way to be political, perhaps the only way that's available. I would argue that it's not even a way of being political, rights are just a way of being publicly social. But anyway, identifying with a rights-based group is your identity. And that set of rights that you're demanding is who you are in the civic space, and it's who you are in the social fabric. So I'll go one at a time, first homosexuality, and then female sexuality, and try to show with each one that the growing popular views on these are really issues of power and interests of politics. And here, by politics, what do I mean? I do not mean what Plato meant by politics, which is creating a way to reach your vision of the good, creating your city in the image of an ideal city. I don't mean what Al-Ghazali meant by politics, which is the highest of the human crafts for creating social order, necessary for our cooperation, collaboration, and living together, where politics is the art of maintaining human happiness in this life and the next life. Instead, what I mean by politics today is what it has historically meant when worldly life, the life on this earth and the life of nations, becomes the only domain that really matters, and the only domain that exists for sure. And under those circumstances, what politics means is the competing interests of various groups and peoples. always in flux, always about competition and competitive advantage and things like that. Always potentially at all-out war of everyone against everyone. That's what Thomas Hobbes said about man's political nature. It's a politics that accepts that men are avaricious by nature, and that destiny, or fate, who is a woman, will favor those men who are bold with her, and that is what Machiavelli said. And it's a politics that says that when two minds meet, the one who says I first and strongly will dominate the one who hesitated, and that's what Hegel said. And it's a politics that says that the way to know if something is moral or not moral is whether or not you can universalize it. That is what Kant said. And so it's no wonder that liberal politics seek to universalize their values until everyone in the world espouses them. Liberal states in this politics enjoy a very special position, such as the United States, among the community of nations. They are the gatekeepers. They get to decide who may enter and who may not. A Muslim society that is reasonable may enter the community of nations. It can even be hierarchical. It doesn't have to be democratic. As long as it signs a culturally liberal catalog of values known as universal human rights, it can join the community of nations. If a nation is outside the community of nations, if it did not sign on to human rights, then liberal states are justified in militarily intervening in those societies. This is what John Rawls says. And so liberal politics can tolerate that you're a Muslim, or a Christian, or any religion, or no religion at all, but liberal politics cannot accept and do not accept if you don't support LGBTQ rights. That's just to give a context. So to repeat, the growing popularity of a certain type of opinions, a certain arc of opinions about sexuality, which is growing among American Muslims, represents politics and economies of power. And I'm going to bring it back to a brief summary of points that I, as a Muslim, draw from our religion. So, number one, as an American, I participate in a culture of not telling people what to do. That is a deeply ingrained maxim of behavior and an ethical code. It's good American adab, and it's a part of who I am. As a law-abiding American, I do not coerce anybody to live by what I believe is correct and good, or to practice my religious obligations. That would make no sense. That is not my God-given purpose. As a Muslim, my neighbors have rights over me, and they have all kinds of rights over me, and it doesn't matter who they are either. They could be any race, any religion, any sexual orientation, any age, any temperament. The rights of the neighbor are the rights of the neighbor, and they are very extensive. If my neighbor is sick, I have to visit her. If my neighbor is celebrating a happy occasion, I have to congratulate her. If my neighbor is grieving, I have to console her. If the food I cook smells so good and so strong that it carries over into her area, I have to go and give her some. If she's a lesbian, none of this changes, right? If she's transgendered, it stays the same. If she openly has multiple heterosexual partners, her rights as a neighbor over me still stand. Number two, according to our religious law, according to what God in his book and through his prophets says, sexual relations between persons of the same sex are unlawful. Transgenderism and mannerisms and dress is also unlawful. Number three, as Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamad Ali and Sheikh Jonathan Brown have shown, Muslim law and Muslim history are full of a deep respect for the privacy of people's private lives, full of the legacy of prophetic mercy and leniency in the application of the law in order to ward off punishment, full of legal nuance to distinguish between innate homosexual tendencies and choice-based ones, and full of legal recognition of mixed-gendered persons, homosexual tendencies, and transgender-esque customs. Number four, one of the inversions of social life that we're dealing with today, dealing without necessarily identifying, is that everything private is now public, right? Everything private is now public. Things turn inside out when you move from unity to dispersion, and so sexuality is essentially private, but it is demanding a public forum. And to say that sexuality is essentially private is not to deny sexuality or oppress sexuality or criminalize it. On the contrary, naming it, I acknowledge it. Abdul Hakim Murad says, Islam, like most traditions, is very sex positive. Sexuality is private because to publicly display or perform it is lewdness. It's not modest and does not safeguard chastity and fidelity. Public sexuality is bad for society and would increase fornication and adultery. But we are way beyond that in liberal politics. Fornication and adultery are not against the law, and most people would agree they're not even moral transgressions either. In liberal politics, the subject or the political person is self-inventing and morally autonomous, which means each of us decides our morality and no one can coerce the moral decisions of another, and we've all heard this. There are many interpretations. I interpret what it means for me to practice my faith, etc., etc. Even enjoining or encouraging another person on moral grounds makes a person a moralizer, and that carries a very bad connotation. Therefore, lewdness as a category, as a degraded moral act, does not exist in liberal politics. Number 5, sexual freedom is a liberal norm and a hard-won political right. The principal benefactors of the sexual revolution and sexual liberation have been women, as we are told. Historically, sexual liberation, or the freedom to have sex outside marriage, without legal recourse, religious constraint, family pressure, or cultural taboo, was intended only for heterosexual coupling. It's only consistent, however, that sexual freedom be extended to homosexual coupling as well. Rights are an ever-expanding catalog, especially in an identity politics mode. New communities are always forming, and the various communities who have been baptized in the attention of identity politics make solidarity connections on the basis of their shared vocabularies of freedom, liberation, and rights. We understand one another's oppressions, in other words. Oppressions are always intersectional. Number 6, from a different point of view, one that centers God's omnipotence, revelation, and religious law, one that accepts mutual rights and communal constraints, that it is good when we enjoin one another to keep to faith, and that it's good when we enjoin one another to be patient in adversity. A point of view that doesn't ignore rights, but does not ignore duties either, because what can a right possibly mean in a universe that never speaks of duties? One person's right is another person's duty to uphold. From this point of view, as a Muslim, lewdness is a serious violation of the sanctity of the public space. And that does not mean that in the name of the sanctity of the public space, we assemble an angry mob against lewdness. God forbid, and may God protect all of us from angry mobs. As Sheikh Sherman Jackson has pointed out, the sanctity of the public space is one of the rights of God. And that can be the basis for Muslims for protecting minorities in the shared public life, including sexual minorities. But to oppose lewdness on principle does mean being able to say, without liberal Muslims disowning you or insulting you publicly, that our religion prohibits homosexuality, that our religion does not accept or normalize homosexuality. Muslims are supposed to be safe from injury and insult and harm from one another. Number 7, in our religion, fornication and adultery are prohibited and disgusting in God's sight, whether they are heterosexual or homosexual. Number 8, again, there is no basis for a moral police force knocking down people's doors or spying on people with cameras, or, for neighbors to gossip and conjecture about one another's sexual activities. Fornication and adultery only arrive at the door of the law, with its coercion and its force, its HUD, if 4 eyewitnesses testify to actual sexual penetration. And of course, I hope that's horrifying to think about, right? For 4 people to testify that they saw fornication with their own eyes. That's the pinnacle of public lewdness. Not same-sex attraction per se, or whether that attraction is innate or choice-based. Number 9, if our Muslim community says same-sex sexuality is unlawful, it doesn't mean, God forbid, that we're inciting to violence against any individual or community. People's lives, bodily safety, property, families, intellectual activity are protected by the higher intents of the same Islamic law, which says sexuality outside of marriage is prohibited, whether it's same-sex or opposite sex. And most obviously, Muslim law is not applicable to non-Muslims. Number 10, if socially and politically LGBTQ identities have become normalized, should Muslims add their endorsement? Not unless we want to earn Allah's displeasure for a trifling gain, is my answer. And the accusation of homophobia, I would argue, is not as serious as a lot of Muslims may fear. It is not homophobia to espouse the religious Muslim position here. I have no irrational fear of same-sex attraction or activity. I have no fear of gay people. And I'm not referring to the question of the legality of gay marriages in the United States or not. You could take Jonathan Brown's position on that and say that for consistency's sake, gay marriages should be recognized legally like straight marriages are. Or you could take Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamad Ali's position on that and say that neither gay nor straight marriages necessarily have to receive legal sanction. Both of those positions are reasoned arguments coming from trusted sources. I'm talking instead about the trifling gain of being that good Muslim in the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy that Mamdani talked about. It's a trifling gain for us to become, with progressive politics, rallying behind the banner of LGBTQ politics, merely more likable to other liberal identity politics peoples and communities, and likable only because of those politics. Withdraw your support from LGBTQ politics and see how much of the social bond remains. Number 11, hating LGBTQ people or looking down upon them as opposed to rejecting the act itself is not and morally cannot be the basis of my interaction with anybody. I can't be imagining what another person looks like before God, because what do I look like before God is the biggest fear in a Muslim's heart. Hate the sin, love the sinner, as Mars Ills said, in order to put it in a more Christian vocabulary. Number 12, let us look at one of the roots of the expectation that Muslims denounce homophobia. And this is where we follow that arc of opinion that's growing amongst American Muslims to liberalize sexuality. We follow that arc to the pot of gold at the end, to power. And so sex, politics, and power, after all. The United States military, as you all know, has made many forages into Muslim elsewheres, dropping many bombs and erasing many villages. The US military has made many Muslim enemies in those places for obvious political reasons. And some of these fight back. And when they do, they're called terrorists or rebel forces, etc. In the name of those rebel threats, here in the US, the government spies on American Muslims, has infiltrated institutions and masajid, and has captured many and imprisoned them overseas in super prisons where torture has been acknowledgedly performed. This is not news to anybody. Number 13, in such prisons, American armed service members, women and men, have directed the torture to be sexual and homosexual in nature, because they were given guidelines based on very bad literature about the Muslim mind, and how the Muslim mind is especially uncomfortable with sex, and even more so with homosexuality. Dogs were also part of torture protocols, because supposedly the Muslim mind also hates dogs, right? Number 14, the American military and the deep tissue of American governance have not acknowledged, let alone began to deal with, their own masculine sexual disorders, misogyny, and homophobia. Is not warmongering a patriarchal rape song? Is not police brutality orgiastic killing power? Judith Butler has argued that it's because the US military is homophobic and targeting Muslims in its imperial endeavors that it paints its Muslim torture victims as especially and irrationally homophobic. The guards civilize their torture victims because theirs is the civilization of freedom, sexual freedom. Astaghfirullah, and this is conceptual doublespeak at its best. It is because secular liberal Europe thinks of itself as a privileged place where sexual radicalism can take place that it wants to keep religiously orthodox immigrants out. Abdul Hakim Murad has spoken about the European cases of immigration tests and how they target applicants' views on homosexuality. To become a citizen in many European countries, you have to profess the normalization of homosexuality. And this is what Butler calls the instrumentalization of the sexual freedom norm by states, by state power. Number 15, homonationalism is the way the American state decides which forms of gayness are acceptable and which are not. This is according to Jasbir Puar. In the US, gays who pass through whiteness and wealth, through certain styles of bodily integrity, consumption, and culture, pass. And the double of this, or its shadow, is the dark figure of the barbarous Muslim terrorist. In liberal politics, agency, which is a person's ability to act, to be, and to think for themselves, is measured in how much they rebel against authority. That is how the liberal tradition was born, and that has been its central value. The authenticity of queerness, says Puar, is measured in how much a person has to break away from their community, to be cast out or to come out. And you'll recall there's some overlap here with how I earlier described identity politics. It's no coincidence, according to Puar, that homonationalism and increasing the amount of LGBTQ persons who can be accepted and acceptable is accompanied simultaneously by ever-growing numbers of populations who are marked off for death, oppression, and surveillance. This is also according to Puar. Number 16. Sexual politics have been carried on the shoulders of so many feminists and feminist movements. Number 17. Feminism is historically a secular liberal discourse. That cannot be debated. Muslim feminisms, queer feminisms, Arab feminisms, African feminisms, black feminisms, Latina feminisms, Christian feminisms, etc., may very well be native expressions, native movements that draw inspiration from liberal feminism, but are nonetheless authentic expressions within those communities. However, that does not change the fact that many ethnic, communal, religious identity politics feminisms share, as a shared substrate, very liberal arguments about the human being, and very secular ways of thinking about the human being and about religion. If a Muslim feminist argues that our religion is patriarchal, and she bases it on laws pertaining to social arrangements, right, the hijab, for example, social arrangements that differentiate between men and women, well then that Muslim feminist has misunderstood that Muslim men and Muslim women, that men and women have a shared spiritual substrate. Right? Abdul Hakim Murad has argued that Muslim women and men are equal where it really counts, equal in opportunities to become, quote, luminous candidates for salvation, end quote. Number 18. That doesn't mean Muslims don't need to clean house. Absolutely, inshallah, we do. We need to eliminate the male superiority complexes from our families, masajid, schools, and our codes of interaction. Number 19. Sisters don't need to be sexually free in a liberal sense in order to be full Muslim women. One cannot be a full Muslim woman or a man doing what is disgusting in Allah's sight. Sisters don't need to resort to insulting brothers in public, using satire and two-bit couplets, in order to be liberated from patriarchy in our community. That seems to me should be a private conversation internal to the community. And some of you may have heard this. When the axe fell in the forest, the trees cried out, but the handle is one of us, right? And that is a brilliant little maxim that I'm borrowing from feminists in order to remind Muslims that we have to be safe from each other's insults and harms. And that's all I'm going to say about dog, kalb. Sisters who would never cover their faces in niqab because it would feel oppressive shouldn't cover their faces in layers upon layers of paint. And I know I'm going to get a lot of backlash for that one, but it needs to be said. You are far more beautiful the way God made you with his two hands, actually. And the effect of that covering by excessive makeup is to take something beautiful and natural and God-given, female sexuality, and turn it into a caricature, a mere market for products in a global capitalist economy that sees human beings as cannon fodder for surplus value. Brothers and sisters who take a lot of selfies, again, I apologize ahead of time, I think we should take a moment and reflect on the fact that we live in a world of our own images. Before this epoch, traditionally, when the human gazed up from the road of life and up from human activity, she saw the wonders of Allah's creation. Right? trees, the sky, the clouds, the sun, the stars, mountains, rivers, seasons, life and death. But now when we look up, we see a brilliant array of our own images, usually airbrushed and whitewashed, framing away the ugly byproducts of our reign as demigods and showing only idealized and impossible, unsustainable images of how humans should look and what we should spend our time doing. To take a selfie, to post a selfie, to barter in the economy of liking and validating one another's snapshots of self-aggrandizement, I think this represents a tremendous loss of consciousness. And please don't take it negatively as moralizing. I'm hoping to enjoin us to reflect on these practices in the spirit of the last ayah of Surah Al-Asr. And also the idea that all is vanity is not a new idea. It's a deep-rooted idea in both East and West. And so now would be a good time to reflect on that. Sisters don't have to interview with a publication that just stopped being hardcore pornographic 2 seconds ago and is still very much softcore pornographic in order to be authentically themselves. And I'm referring to Noor Tagouri's interview last year with Playboy magazine. And what does that mean anyway, authentic self-expression? Self-invention is a liberal theory of the human being. A Quranic theory of the human being, I think, would be more self-mastery, where the self to be mastered is desire, whim, appetite, including self-aggrandizement and vanity. And the self that does the mastering is God consciousness, or Tawheed, inshallah. Number 10. When I look back over a year ago to the Orlando nightclub shooting, I wish that as different communities paid their condolences and comforted the grieving, mutually condemning murder, of course, that Muslims and LGBTQ persons and communities connected their hearts in a mutual human family love without signing that social contract that says gays and Muslims agree to join their identity politics and support each other's platforms unconditionally. Loving your neighbor for the sake of Allah, for the sake of God's pleasure, without whitewashing what God has deemed unlawful, would be a far greater accomplishment than loving everything everyone does in their private life because you're not here to judge. Number 21. Of course we're not here to judge, but no one would deny that God has given us all discernment. Otherwise, how could we be morally accountable for our own actions? And God has given us the free will to obey or disregard His law. And if the word obey already conjures up in your mind backwardness, submissiveness, lack of thinking for yourself, blindness, etc., then perhaps the liberal culture and identity politics responsible for that association need to be reconsidered and left by the wayside for something much better. Inshallah. Jazakallahu khairan. If there was anything good in it, may Allah accept it. I'm sorry for all the mistakes. I look forward to the responses, and if a conversation does ensue, I hope it will be respectful, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And 2 announcements. So the first announcement is that Lamppost Productions is very happy to announce Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamid Ali will be giving an online course beginning September 16th on Usul al-Fiqh. The title of the course is Islamic Criteria for Moral Judgment, selected readings from Tilamsani's Miftah al-Wusul, inshallah. So check out the link in the description. Of course, Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamid Ali, we should all be so lucky as to learn from him. So check the link in the description. The second announcement, inshallah, Islam and Global Politics is a course I'll be teaching at Respect Graduate School beginning next week. Registration is still open. Contact Respect Graduate School if you would like to register for that course. It will be held in Wayne, New Jersey, not online.